All right, so in the last class, we basically discovered how to set up and download BlueJ. We set up how to construct a project and then create a class. Um, and we learn how to set up a class and learn some basic lines of code that you could use. So let's create a new project in this case. Let's do fourth program. Let's create it. We'll create my class. It's going to be called fourth program. Let's create it. Here we go, fourth program. Doesn't really matter what your uh, project and class name is, but remember here that you must set um, the name of your class, whatever you set it to appear here. So if I'm right for program, there we go. Always remember opening and closing parentheses. I'm going to start it off public static void main string. Oops. Yeah, main string main string args. Here we go. So basically, you don't really need to know this, but of course, a public class or anyone can access it, so that's good. Static, it's a static method, which means it operates at the class level. You don't have to construct an object to get it, which is why we never constructed an object. Void means it doesn't return anything. Main means it's the main method, and that's basically all you have to know to it. You actually don't need to know any of that um, to make it work. So yeah. So let's just in the last class we basically said um, something like this: system.out.println hello world, and this is basically it's a tradition that computer scientists use this line as their first ever line that they program. So some things to note. So system.out.println, this is basically something called a method, and it's telling the compiler to print it out in the console log, we call it. It's just tells the compiler to print it out on a blank piece of text. And then these quotes here are used to denote a string or or multiple characters. So this is multiple characters. There's around 13 characters in here. And a semicolon here is used to end the statement. So we always need to remember those things for every statement we write. We need to remember the semicolon and we need to remember proper syntax. Otherwise, it won't run. So in the last class, we also discussed some simple variable declarations such as int. So when we use int, type int, we want to create a variable that's set to an integer. So let's just say, so we create an int and then we just set it to whatever name we want it. So let's just say x in this case. Int x is equal to, of course, we wanted to set it to an integer, so just choose 8. So in this case, what this line is telling the compiler is that we create a variable called x, and we set it to 8, which is an integer, which is why we use type int. So there we go. Let's just say we want to print out x instead of 8, so we do not use quotes here because it's not a string of characters. So we just do the system.out.println x. So you might have some guesses to what it prints out, but if we run it, should print out 8 because we set x to 8. There's other variables that some other types that we also discussed, such as string. Let's delete this for clarity's sake. Let's delete all of this actually. So string, as you can see, there's some errors. So print it out red, but I fixed it by adding a space. So string x, or we can just name it s1, is equal to, now we do need quotes here because it is denoting a line of characters or multiple characters. So hello world, and we always want to end our statements with a semicolon. Then we print out system.out print line. Instead of printing out hello world now, we can just print out S1, and you might have some guesses of how this will go down, and should print out hello world. Great. There's also other types that computer scientists use. Another common one is double. So before we said with int, we said something like this. Now, if we printed out 8.0, you might have some guesses of what this would do. It will cause a compile time error because you cannot convert an int to a double because an int is only used to denote integers. So in this case, to denote 8.0, we have to use type double. Double is basically used to denote anything that requires a decimal point. So let's do D1 in this case, 8.0. Let's delete all this for clarity so no one gets confused. So now we just have this, we compile it, and it should work. There we go. And now we can just system.out.println it like what we did before, D1. That. Let's do it. Here we go. And it prints out 8.0. Great. Now we learn how to set up variables and create variables, set them to a value. We learn how to call them. Let's system out print line. Let's learn some harder stuff. So there are things called methods. So methods are basically just code that accesses the variable or an attribute to the variable. So let's just start off with a string s1. Let's say hello world again. There we go. So now let's make it print out something. Let's make it print out, let's say we want to print out how many characters are in hello world. So to do that, we're going to use a method called length. So s1 dot length. So why did I need these open and closing parentheses here? Right here. This is something that you put in called parameters. So you would put in parameters inside a method. So some methods require you to input a specific range in between. So let's just say like 3.0, 5.0, right? So if we disregard length for a minute, this is basically we're just inputting parameters into the method. But length basically it does not require any parameters, so we just use open and close parentheses to say to the compiler that hey, there's no parameters here. So same thing, open close parentheses should work, and it should print out how many characters are in here, which should be, if you have any guesses, should be 13. And here we go, 13. So that's basically a method. It's a brief introduction to the method. One thing to note, to denote a method, you would use the character, or you would use just a period. So in this case, S1, or in this case, we use a period to denote that we're telling the compiler to call a method. We want to call the method, or we want to retrieve attributes to use in the method from S1. So that's why we would put S1.length. For example, if I put string S2, and let's just delete this real quick. Let's create another string. Let's just say hello in this case. There we go. So if you do system.out.println, S2 in this case, .length, same thing. Now instead of retrieving the length method from S1, it's going to retrieve it from S2. So it should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So let's just take a look. And yeah, it's 5. So we're going to explain that in more detail next class. Now so now we're going to do some arithmetic. So let's just delete all of this. So let's just say I have an int x is equal to 5, and then I have an int y is equal to 10. So basically, adding, subtracting, dividing, they are all basically the same things that you would do on paper would be the same thing that you would do on a compiler. So for example, I want to print out system.out.println. I want to add x and y. So let's say x plus y. So what do we do? So here we go. So 5, so it should be 5 plus 10. So it should print out 15 if we are not wrong. And there we go, 15. So that's good. Let's print out system.out.println. Let's do subtraction, 5 minus 10. Should print out negative 5, right? Now, division is a little bit trickier because if you do 5 divided by 10, you would think that the answer is 0.5, correct? But it would be, let's run it, 0. And why is that? Well, so we said that 5 divided by 10 is 0.5, right? But remember, we called x and y, or we set x and y to be ints. So remember that ints can only accept integers. So when the compiler sees that it returns 0.5, it's basically going to truncate the end of, it's basically going to truncate everything past the decimal point. For example, if I have 2, or let's say 5/4 x divided by y, let's just say this is 5 and we set y to 4, so it should be 5/4, should be 1.25, but in reality it's only going to print out 1 because the 1.25, the 0.25 gets truncated off, it gets completely cut off because we set it to ints. So how do we make it run decimals? Well, remember that we have a type called double. So double x over 5, so let's just run it, x over y. Now, important thing to note here, as long as you have one double, it's going to print out a decimal because double has higher precedence. So if you had a double here, it would print out decimal. If you had a double here, it would print out decimal. Let's just say double here and int here. This would also print out decimal. If you had double twice, it would also print out decimal. So all those combinations would make a decimal. So I'm just going to go back. This should print out a decimal if we are correct. And boom, 1.25. Same thing with multiplication. Let's just do, for example, let's set this back to ints. Of course, we're going to print out integers. So let's just say 5, 4. To denote multiplication, you would use an asterisk. So system.out.println, so 5 times 4 should print out 20, if I'm correct, and it does. Let's just say it prints out 5.33 now, instead of, or sorry, let's just say we print out 5.33, we would need a double. Here we go. Of course, it's going to compile because doubles always can accept or things past the decimal. So we should get 5.33 times 4. And putting 1.32. All right, the last I guess you could call operand that we're going to use, or that computer scientists use, that is very arguably the most important one out of all of these, is something called mod. Probably never learned this before, and that's okay. So basically, let's say we create a variable called say 5, for example. So to denote mod, we would use a percent. So let's just run it for fun. Let's just run this for fun. So you try to create a guess of how this is going to run. So I'm going to run it. It's going to print out 1. Well, how did this happen? So mod basically takes the remainder of the two operators. I mean the operands. This is actually an operator. That's my bad. But it basically takes the remainder of the two operands. So the operands in this case are 5 and 2. So basically, it's just basically doing division, right? 5 over 2, it should be 2 remainder 1. So it's basically just going to return that remainder. So let's create another example. I just set x to 6. So now if you do 6 mod 2, right, it's going to be 6 over 2, and it's going to take the remainder of that. 6 over 2 is 3, so it's a clean division, so there is going to be no remainder, so we would expect mod, or the remainder of the division, to be 0. Let's check it out, see if it works. Forgot to delete this. Let's try it again. And it's 0. So that's basically a brief introduction to mod, multiplication, subtraction, and addition. So in this video, we learned that we basically learned, or we reviewed ints. We reviewed system.out.println. We introduced something called a double, which is basically printing out a decimal. This or it can't be. Yeah, we already defined it, so let's make it y real quick. So basically introduced doubles. We introduced basic, we glanced over the method, which we denote by period. So just say x.length. We glanced over parameters, which are basically something that you put in to modify the method. Oh, my bad. We need to create. Just edit this a little bit. So yeah, this goes away because x is not int, but now it should work. So we basically went over the length method, which basically just goes over how many characters a string has. So in this case, this should print out 5, so prints out 5, right? We basically went over that. We went over basic arithmetic, such as plus. We went over minus. We went over division. We went over multiplication, right? But we also introduced something new called mod, which is basically taking the remainder of the division of two things. So for example, 5 over 4. 5 over 4, the remainder of that is 1. So mod 5 mod 4 will return 1. And that's basically what we covered thus far, and some new things. So hope you guys enjoy, and I guess I'll see you guys in the next video, or when we have class again.